All right, so thank you everyone for joining us today. Today we'll be learning about Disability Cultural Competency with the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition. All right. And before we get started, I just want to give a brief background to CAEE. Our mission is to advance environmental education in Colorado by fostering collaboration, mobilizing support, and driving excellence. So one CAEE member reaches approximately 900 learners, and with our 850 CAEE members, reach over 800,000 learners every year in Colorado. And one way that we can do this is by having our CAE monthly webinar series, which is where we have different monthly topics of interest to the environmental education community in Colorado. And doing that, we can share and spark ideas, improve practice, and connect with one another. And we do have some awesome upcoming events. On March 9th, we have our 2022 Careers in Natural Resource Summit. And on March 10th, we have Equity and Inclusion for Organizational Teams. So if you're interested in either one of those, you can visit our website and sign up there. And then I know we're all very well versed in Zoom, but so I can run through this pretty quickly, but please just keep your line muted while others are speaking. If you have any questions for a presenter, just use the chat function, or you can raise your hand and we can have some interaction that way. And like I mentioned at the beginning, if you can just chat in your name, organization, and where you're connecting from. And then also you'll receive a recording from today that you can view later. And then before we get started, I would just like to do a land acknowledgement and recognition of racial injustice. So one way that we can support equity is by beginning our day by acknowledging our history of colonization and oppression, and that it is still continuing today. It is important to remember that what we know as Colorado today was the traditional home of the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, the Pueblo tribes, Shoshone tribe, and the Ute Nation. Historically, environmental education has been tailored to white communities, and the contributions of Black, Indigenous, and people of color are often excluded from our narrative. Black, Indigenous, and people of color have vibrant, rich histories and cultures that contribute to our field. We all have the responsibility to continue working to change the systems that continue to allow injustice and inequity to exist. All right, and before we get started, I would love to introduce our presenter for today, Julie Reiskin. She is the Executive Director from the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition. So Julie Reiskin, like I said, is the Executive Director of the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition. In that role, Julie assists other organizations with assuring real and meaningful participation by clients at all levels. Through CCDC and the disability community, Julie has gained expertise on nonprofit accountability and best practices, publicly funded long-term community-based services, disability rights law, public benefit, and the intersectionality of systemic and individual advocacy. Julie has proposed and helped to implement many solutions to create a sustainable and client-friendly Medicaid program, such as the consumer direction as a delivery model. She acted as a respected advocate for individuals and has trained many others in health advocacy and health policy. Prior to becoming the executive director in CCDC in 1996, Julie served as the organization's policy analyst. All right, so that is our introduction. And before I pass it over, I just want to today will be a pretty interactive session. So if you guys could have your or if you're comfortable with having your cameras on, that'd be great. And yeah, just like I said, it will be discussion based and really interactive. So let me switch slides. Yeah. Pass it over to Julie.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me and being willing to talk about disability cultural competency. And I always start with saying, is there such a thing? And yes, there is. And we'll talk about why that is. But I want to really start by thanking you all for the work you're doing. When I was looking at all the places in the chat, it's like, well, I want to leave and go on a tour around the state and go to all these cool places. It sounds, I didn't know there was a bear place in Netherlands, for example. I don't think I've heard of any of these places, and I go all over the state. So this looks really cool. And I really appreciate the work that all of you do, because you know, I don't know much about, you know, environmental work, but I know I kind of like having a planet and an earth. And so the work you do is super important and benefits all of us. So when I do these presentations live and I'm in front of people, people can see that I use a wheelchair, so people will see that I have a visible disability. And but then I always say that I have a hidden disability, and that's that I'm from the East Coast, and sometimes I can talk really fast. So if I talk too fast, just tell me to slow down. I won't hurt my feelings. And I do want this to be interactive, so there'll be places where I stop or ask you to do stuff or chime in, and you can use the chat or just unmute yourself and say something, whatever you're more comfortable with. So if you can go to the next slide. And I also want to say, feel free to ask whatever questions or say whatever comes up. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I've never melted yet, and certainly I'm not going to melt today. It's like freezing, but it really doesn't hurt my feelings. Like if you say something that maybe isn't kind of in line with what our community feels and thinks, I can just say, well, here's what our thinking is. It's really not going to upset me or hurt my feelings. When we do any kind of equity work, and it sounds like you all have engaged in equity work, we all understand it's a journey. It's not an event where we establish perfection. It's a journey, and the only way we can take this journey is if we feel safe to talk. So there's no like disability correctness police that are going to come and arrest you. It's again, and even in our community, disability is a really broad word, as we'll talk about, and so please don't feel like you're going to get in trouble or scolded or anything if you don't say the right thing, because there isn't always a right thing to say. So we're going to start with talking about definitions and language, then do an activity about what do we feel and think. There's some words around disability that strike a lot of feelings in us. Then we'll talk about what's disability culture and kind of competency, and then end with legal compliance, which is important if you're representing an organization or you're employing people or you're an employee, and versus a welcoming culture, and why both are really important, and really kind of what the difference is. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So let's start by saying, what is a disability? And I'm just using the legal definition. There are lots and lots of definitions of disability. So for example, if someone is applying for Social Security disability, that's a totally different definition. If someone's a veteran and they are determined disabled by the VA, that's a different definition. I'm going to give you the definition of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act, and other civil rights laws, such as like the Air Carriers Access Act. And it's a three-pronged definition. The main part is someone who is substantially impaired in one or more major life activities. And sometimes the word is substantially limited. It's the same thing. And major life activities are things that everyone can do. So it's things that we would all think about, like walking, seeing, hearing, but it also involves things like self-care for adults working, learning, communicating. And then it also involves things that our bodies do that we don't necessarily do consciously, like having an immune system, digesting, breathing. So it's all of those things. And a substantial impairment or limitation just means it has to be something, that's a big deal. So if someone says, well, gee, I'm in my 50s and I can't run a 5-minute mile anymore, that's not a substantial impairment or a substantial limitation. If someone is in their 50s or even at any age and says, I can't walk to the mailbox, or I can't walk 2 blocks to a bus stop, that is a substantial limitation. That's a much more expansive definition than the definitions under programs like veterans or workers' comp or Social Security. And that's intentional. That's because when you're giving out rights and protections from discrimination, there's no need to limit it. It's not a finite amount of what you're giving. When you're giving cash and medical care, that is, the government at least perceives that there's a finite amount. I don't know that it's as finite as they think it is, but it's just a very different level. So there's two other groups of people that are protected under the ADA who are not actually disabled. One is people who have a history of being substantially impaired in one or more major life activities. So what's a history? Well, history is you did have a limitation and now you don't. We were writing this law in the 80s. And in the 80s, what we were really thinking about here is people who had mental health issues or got mental health treatment, but then or substance abuse treatment, and then kind of got over it or got, really, it wasn't like a permanent, like serious mental illness. It was just like, like a struggling adolescent or something. And that, of course, applies to that group. But the group that it's helped, I think, more than anyone is people with cancer. Because in the 80s, you didn't have cancer and go back to work. Like you had cancer and you went to hospice and you died. And now a lot of, and same with HIV, AIDS, like a lot of people have histories of stuff like cancer, and they maybe take some time off, they get treatment and they go back to work, and they can't be discriminated against by an employer. The other group are people who are regarded as being substantially impaired, meaning people think they are impaired really when they're not. This one was written for, again, this was in the 80s, it was written for people with HIV AIDS. There was a lot of pressure to leave them out because, again, there was a lot of really inappropriate, wrong information about that condition and about gay people at the time. And so there was just kind of a lot of blaming, but that was also a time when people, thought you could get AIDS by swimming in the same swimming pool, and and it led to a lot of discrimination. Like even two men walking together, who go into a restaurant, like would not be served, and all kinds of stuff like that. And it certainly, hopefully we've moved on from some of that ridiculousness, but it does help people who might not be able to prove in court that they have a substantial limitation, but people think they do. One of my employees really fits this. She has cerebral palsy, but it's mild. So if you look at her, you don't see anything, but when she talks, you can tell that there's a disability. People often think she has an intellectual disability, which she doesn't. She has like some coordination issues. So like her handwriting kind of looks like a third grader. It's like really big and kind of messy. But there's nothing that's really substantial. But people often think that she has all kinds of problems. She doesn't. Or also someone who's been burned. A lot of times when people have a lot of facial disfigurement, people make assumptions that they have like a lot more problems, a lot more disability than they actually do. So when we talk about disability, that's the legal definition. Any questions? Or so now I'm going to get to you can go to the next slide. I'm going to get to what people always ask and just start there of what's the right word. People always say, well, what's the right word right now? No, go back. Yeah. What do we call people with disabilities? And you'll notice me saying disability and disabled interchangeably. Our community is in a turning point right now where for many years we had what people consider to be person first language. We're having slide issues, aren't we?
Yeah, sorry about that. It's just automatically dancing. So let me just have it right here.
I've had that happen too. So we've had things. So for many years it was people first language, where people were taught to say the person with a disability and never to use, say, like disabled or using the disability first. And our community is kind of changing now and looking more at identity first language, where we use the word with pride, and we'll talk about disability pride a little bit later. So you'll hear people doing it both, and there's certain groups of people with disabilities that absolutely feel the need to use identity first language, and particularly that's the deaf and autistics. Those are the two groups that seem to be the most interested in the identity first, but certainly the rest of us are also changing to that. What we really don't like, though, and that's pretty universal for disabled adults, is euphemisms. Can people put in the chat some of the euphemisms that you've heard? um, or words that you've heard. Okay, so there's a question. Can you say what you mean by identity in this context? So basically, having an identity as a person with a disability. So if I say I'm a disabled woman, then I would be putting my identity as a disabled, saying that's like basically declaring that's part of how I identify. So it's similar to like when people use pronouns or put pronouns in their signature block, they're saying I identify as, whatever it is that their pronouns say. Does that answer the question? Okay. So what are words that you guys have heard to describe disability? Physically challenged, good. Yep, that's one. Differently able, yeah, those words are just awful, but yes, we've heard those. And a lot of those words come in special needs too. Now, the word special needs is still used a lot in the parent community, from parents of kids with disabilities. And the reason that's used is, the reason that that's used is twofold. One is parents have not, it takes, especially when you're not planning on having a disabled kid, like you're not adopting one on purpose. It takes them some time, just like it takes people with disabilities who acquire disabilities some time to kind of get comfortable with that. The other thing is sometimes kids are just delayed, or they just have some issue and they're not really disabled. And so that word kind of becomes all encompassing. Now, adults with disabilities hate that word, hate the term special needs, because the word special has been really weaponized against people with disabilities. Like, we used to have a bumper sticker that said special education is neither. And that word, again, it's just been a word that's really been kind of weaponized. It almost feels like a dog whistle kind of word. Neurodivergent is not it's not really offensive. It's just a way of describing people who think differently. But you're right, it's another word for disability. And we don't think and the reason why we like just the word disability is it's not a bad word. We feel like we need to reclaim the word and not think of it as like a bad word or something you shouldn't say, because we have pride in that, and we don't feel like we need to cover it up either. We don't need to pretend it's something else, or to not use the word. And some people say, yeah, but it has the dis in it, which is a negative. And it's like, no, that's reality. If you have a disability, you have something you can't do. That's part of it. That there's nothing wrong with that. And that's really what we're trying to kind of manage here. When we talk about kind of word choice, you always want to be sensitive to like what we call systemic devaluation. So for example, that like negative language, like when someone says someone's a victim of or suffering from, that's really negative language. So like someone's a victim of a stroke, or someone had a stroke. We don't see ourselves as victims. Now that doesn't mean someone who happens to have a disability can't be victimized. Someone might be a victim of an attack, or a victim of a fire. That's different, but just having a disability doesn't make you a victim, and it doesn't mean that we suffer from it. Again, that doesn't mean that there aren't aspects of disability that cause pain and suffering, but just the fact that one has a disability doesn't mean that people are suffering, and certainly doesn't corner the market on suffering. There are also words like in the healthcare world, they'll use the term frequent flyer for someone that uses a lot of services, and that's meant in a really derogatory way. It's kind of a microaggression, and certainly the R word. We've actually removed that word retarded from state law. Like state laws can have that word anymore, and things like psycho. The other thing that I've been talking a lot about, particularly in the past 5 years, is it's really important not to identify bad behavior, meanness, bullying, and abusing of power with disability. So for example, if someone is abusing their power, or someone's a bully, like a leader or a boss who's a bully, don't say he's crazy or she's crazy. That's, or, oh, they must be mentally ill. If someone has policies that we disagree with, don't say they have dementia. You can say all the bad things you want about the policies, because that's what we should do. I mean, that's our job, right? Is to criticize bad policies, but don't make it about how someone walks, or if someone misses a word here and there, or someone's, physical attributes. We also want to make sure that we're not putting disability words on hateful behavior. So there's no disability that makes you a bully. Like even something like Tourette's, where awful words come out of people's mouth as verbal tics, that happens. It's not at someone. It just happens. It's just like, it's not directed at someone. A lot of times if someone is having some sort of, mental break, it'll be pretty obvious. Whenever there's a horrible crime like a school shooting, or the Aurora Theater shooting or something like that, people always want to jump to mental illness. But if someone's like in the throes of like a schizophrenic break, they can't organize a trip to the store, much less figure out how to like bomb some big building. And that takes a lot of, those big crimes take a lot of organization. And so every time that happens, I was talking with a colleague who's a male, who's Muslim, and he goes through the same thing. Every time there's one of these things, it's always like, oh God, I hope it's not, I'm always like, I hope it's not someone with a mental illness. And he's always like, yeah, I hope it's not a man who's Muslim, because just knowing how people react when those things happen, and that's all tied up in language. And it's hard. It's hard to not use some of these words, because because it's so baked into our language. It's the other thing I wanted to say about language is it's okay to use a disability word with someone. So for example, one of my bosses is blind. I might say to her, did you see the news last night? That's not offensive. I mean, obviously she would have heard it, not seen it, but that's just colloquially how we talk. If I use a wheelchair, if someone says, oh, are you gonna, walk over or take the bus? That isn't offensive. I mean, obviously they know it's not actual physical walking, but when I take my dogs out, I say I walk my dogs. I don't say I roll my dogs. It's just how we talk, and that you're never gonna, it's not offensive at all to use those terms. Any questions or comments about this section? Okay, now you're gonna do some work. Have you all used a Jamboard? Maybe if we can't do the slides, that you could take them down, I could see everyone. Oh, there we go. I'm gonna put a link in the chat that's gonna take us to a Jamboard. Have you all used a Jamboard before? No, some. So we'll just, if you just go to that, I'll wait till I see everyone in, and everyone's anonymous, and you all get an animal. And so, but I don't know who's what animal. So like there's a giraffe and a blobfish and a dragon and a chameleon. They have kind of cool animals. So just as a reminder, when you're in the Jamboard, so that we're going to go through 7 frames, but what you're going to do is you're going to go to a sticky note, which is on the far left. You'll see like a pen, an eraser, an arrow, and if you click on sticky note, you can choose your color, and then you can write something. So I'm just going to do test, and you'll see it comes up. Now I'll delete it, and then so we're going to spend some time. What I'm going to ask you to do is to just say, what is it that you think and feel when you see some different words? So, and we have 7 of these words. So, and when we go to the next one, I'll just tell you to hit the arrow at the top where it says 1 out of 7, and then we'll go to 2. But let's start with disability and just type in just whatever word first comes to your mind when you think of the term disability. What do you think about? Okay, good. Okay. Oh, good. I like this one. Challenge both for the disabled person and the educator. That's a really good one. So what you'll see is that there's kind of some themes. There's like people think that things could be a challenge and be difficult, that someone might need help. Those are all accurate things. I'm saying some stuff around being different, which is true. And then some people are looking at access and then inclusivity, which is good. These are good. So now let's go to the next frame. And again, there's up, it says 1 out of 7, you just go to 2. And now the word is schizophrenic. And what do you think when you hear that? Don't really understand? Scared? Good. Loss of control. Manic? Good. Paranoid? Shutter Island, the movie. I'll have to watch that. Okay, these are good. So some people identify symptoms like, paranoia or hallucinations or manic. Someone says my grandma. So someone knows someone who has schizophrenia. Unstable, fear, feeling like you don't have the skills to engage with folks who have this condition, loss of control, isolation, which is definitely an issue, different reality. I think schizophrenic is one of those conditions that does really scare people. And it's a serious mental illness. It's not an easy thing to manage or to live with. People with schizophrenia can have, very different levels of functioning. Anything from, getting a doctorate degree and being a professional to, not being able to work at all and everything in between. And sometimes the medications can cause other types of disabilities as well. But one of the big myths is that people with schizophrenia are violent or dangerous. And a lot of people think that, and there's just no data to back that up. That doesn't mean people don't behave in ways that might scare people sometimes. But again, the ability to plan a crime is really not there, particularly when someone is acutely in the throes of it. It's often a condition that comes and goes, just like bipolar disorder. So let's go to the next one. Whoops, and look at dementia. What do you feel here? Okay, so we also see some themes here, right? We see a lot of like loss and grief and sadness, and losing, and that's something we associate with older people. What does anyone see kind of the difference between dementia and schizophrenia and how we look at that? Anyone want to comment on that?
The words here seem more sympathetic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like sad versus scary. And a sense of loss is very clear with dementia, but not so much with schizophrenia, where people do have like that same level of loss. It is younger in life, so it might not be. And most people have like a kind of before and after personality in a way. Now, some people with dementia are not unhappy. Some are very agitated and unhappy. Some are not. It depends, but I think dementia and certain mental illnesses really challenge us to look at how is it that we look at people who don't think the same way we do. I think it's just a much deeper challenge for all of us than being able to look at someone who's like blind or deaf or uses a wheelchair. That's a lot more concrete and easier to kind of not other them. It's to say, oh, well, okay, they're just like me, except they don't see or they don't walk. Whereas when someone thinks differently, it's harder to connect. And that doesn't mean anyone's bad, it just is. And someone said grief for family members. I think that's really true. It's really hard as a family member or a loved one to see someone become someone different, because the person that you loved is now someone different. And that's just very, very hard. Again, that may or may not be distressing for the person. I don't think we have the science yet to know. So let's pivot now. And what comes to mind when you hear the term disability rights laws? Okay, good. Expensive. Legal protection. Equity, access, good. Bureaucratic mess. Fear of doing it wrong. Unfair and need of. Protection for business, that's interesting. ADA compliant picnic tables in the middle of the woods. But there actually is a reason for that. But it's just funny. All right, lots of lip service. So you see here kind of the real bifurcated thoughts on this, where people see, you know, equity, access, protection, and then but then on the other hand, it's a bureaucratic mess. There's fear. It's a striving. You know, things aren't done right, like the wheelchair ramps that are half-assed and too steep, unfair, in need of revisions. One of the things with laws is, first of all, laws are only as good as their enforcement. The ADA was passed in 1990, and the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. And I don't think anyone, I hope no one would say that we're over our racism as a country, or that we figured that out, because we haven't. And that was many years before the ADA was passed. And then the complication with the ADA is it does deal with physical things. And so as society changes, those things change. So for example, Colorado is the only state in the country, and the ADA doesn't have this done yet, that has actual regulations about website accessibility. So you would think in this day and age, wouldn't that be a thing? Well, you know, of course it's a thing, but laws take a long time to change, and to change the ADA literally takes an act of Congress. So, I'm interested you know, what the protection for businesses, if anyone wants to talk to that. I've never seen that come up, of how disability rights laws are seen as a protection for business. Does anyone want to speak to that? Because I think it's great. But I think this bifurcation is really typical for, you know, to kind of how people feel about this. I also think people think it's a lot more complicated than it is. So businesses don't seem to care about actual access, just more fear of being sued. I think that's true. I think that's been true with employers as well. Employers, I think, think that the ADA gives protections to people with disabilities that it actually doesn't. Or that it, like, if you hire someone with a disability, that you can't fire them, which is totally not true. What's been interesting is that employers are a lot more open now because of the labor shortage. So they're a lot more open to hiring people with disabilities than they've ever been, but because they're desperate. Which is great in my book. But I also think most lawsuits are more about attitude than actual access. I mean, you could go anywhere and find something wrong. I think that most people who litigate do it after repeated tries to get someone to listen and resolve something, and just can't get anyone to pay attention. And then they get to that level of frustration. So finally, I want you to do the same thing for disability pride. And I expect I'll get some, what is that? Cool. Wow. Well, this is very impressive. Most people don't really get this, and often say, well, why are you proud for something that you didn't create, like having a disability? And people don't get that it is all about what you're talking about, which is taking back power and being part of a community, and owning who you are. That is really cool. So we can go out of this. And if you could go back to the slides, that would be great. I like to do this to make sure that we're really kind of owning, as you talk about disability cultural competency and disability justice, to kind of take some time to think about what is it that we all feel with different types of disability. Concepts and ideas and thoughts and feelings. I should have said at the beginning, the term cross disability is when people actually don't know much anymore. And that just means that we believe that we have more in common than not, between different disability types, and that we work better together. So I'm sure that you have all discussed the difference between equality and equity. Okay, yeah, in terms of justice, yeah. Thank you. I will, I hope. So we have equality versus equity, and I think, again, this is not a new concept anymore, but people, if we say everything is the same, that completely leaves out most people from our community. If we talk about equity and people, getting what they need so that we can all engage in our communities and in society, that doesn't mean we're all going to have equal outcomes, of course. It just means that it levels the playing field some, and it might not totally level the playing field, but it gives everyone an opportunity to participate. And if you could go to the next slide, I'd also like to talk about some of these other words of, like, what is inclusion? Because that's a word that gets thrown around a lot. And what's kind of the progression that you can look at in a community, in an organization, in a workplace. And so you start with separation, which is the history of people with disabilities has really been, segregated and separated, where, and that's even changing within generations. I can't see all of you, but the ones I can see, you look a little younger than me. When I went to school, and I did not become disabled till I was about 20. But so when I went to school, there were no kids with disabilities that I went to school with. I knew one woman in our neighborhood who had a disability, and she was like the scary lady in the wheelchair that none of us ever talked to. And I had one friend who had a brother who had, I'm assuming now, was Down syndrome, who went to a special school that we never saw him. And I don't think it's like that anymore, which is good. But when they, in what led to the ADA being written was we were totally segregated. And we didn't really know, people with disabilities didn't, especially those who were born with disabilities. So I grew up with non-disabled privilege and then became disabled. So I had all of that privilege, like, of having had an education, having the expectation that, of course, I get to go wherever I want. But a lot of my contemporaries didn't. They grew up with segregation. So you start with total separation, and then when you see that there's something else, you kind of move into exclusion, where you can see inside, but you're not being let in. And that's when you say, well, there's something else here. How do we get in? The next move is integration, and I think that's where a lot of us are now. I think that's where a lot of schools are, is, you could come to the school, and you'll be, you might even be able to go to some classes, but you're still gonna not really have a lot of friends who aren't disabled. And you can apply this to race, you can apply this to ethnicity, you can apply this to gender, you can apply this to sexual orientation, you can apply this to anything, because it's the same pattern. So so you get integrated, meaning you're in, but you're not really included. And then the last is included, and inclusion is, so, a good nonprofit example of integration is, okay, we're going to hire someone with a disability, but only as a receptionist, and not as a manager, or not on a board, or not as a frontline worker. and inclusion is really where all of us are integrated in everything at all levels of whatever the organization. In a school, it might be in every class, you know, in drama club, in the baseball team, and again, as appropriate. So if someone has a disability where they can't, you know, they couldn't physically play football, maybe they wouldn't want to be on the football team. Maybe they'd want to be a coach or a manager if they really are interested in football. But maybe they'd want to be on the drama team or whatever. So inclusion doesn't mean that everyone has to be everywhere. It means that there have to be kind of opportunities to be everywhere. And yeah, the cochlear implant community is a great example. Lots of issues around that, where you know, there's people that want to live as a hearing person versus, and then there's people who are deaf. We talk about big D and little d deaf. The big D deaf are people who embrace sign language and very much reject cochlear implants, to the point of being intolerant sometimes. And then there's people with cochlear implants, and cochlear implants is a device that you get implanted that kind of makes people able to hear to some degree. I don't know that it's total hearing, and there's a lot of complications with it, but it's really making a choice of how do you want to show up in the world. And people change over time. I mean, I've known people who wore cochlears for years and then took them off, put them away, or turned them off and said, no, I want to do total sign language now, and vice versa. So it's, but that's a great example. We could go to the next slide. And I'm just going to pick on Lauren because I can see you. Can you read this slide?
Yeah, inclusive. It does not mean if you want to participate, conform to the cultural social norm of the majority. It means diversity is so vital that every person will have his needs met, so that all have access to the same opportunities to learn, play, and live.
Great, thanks. I just realized the slide isn't terribly inclusive because it says just his needs, but I didn't realize. I've used this slide so many times and that never jumped out at me till this minute. What does that bring up for people? People can just unmute yourself and share.
I like that it takes the emphasis off of everything needing to be the same, and like specifically everything needing to align to what a lot of people view as normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of takes, you know, we sometimes I think say, well, we like diversity as long as everything's exactly the way I'm used to it, and then it's okay.
I really like the part where they emphasize play, because so often when you talk about inclusivity, you don't think about how people like have fun. It's like, we're going to make it happen in terms of work and what that looks like.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because I think you're right. And I think even, you know, we think of what's necessary, and that's always like school and work, and or just like, you know, like life, like safety or whatever. And it's like people need more than that. And that's something I think even our own community is coming to, and that's part of the whole disability pride and the evolution over generations. I had a young person say to us a couple of years ago at one of our events, more than a couple of years ago, because it was an in-person event, so it was more than a couple of years ago. And this young woman said, you know, my generation is really grateful for the work you all did so that we're not living in institutions anymore and that we're in the community, but just not living in an institution is not enough for us. Like, we expect to get married and buy a house and have a career. And so just not living in a nursing home just is not going to be enough for us. And I thought that was awesome. And I think she also talked about, you know, we want to, you know, some of us want to engage in sports, some of us want to engage in drama, or, we want to have the same kind of full lives everyone else does. And I think that's so relevant to the work you all do, because in a state like Colorado, where most people are super outdoorsy, people, being able to participate, in the outdoors, again, in a meaningful way, that doesn't mean that every single person with every type of disability is going to be able to go on every kind of like surface or whatever. But there are accessible, like there is accessible hiking, and there's a lot out there. But and there are a lot of people that have disabilities. I think we often think of disability as like a wheelchair or blind, and there are a lot of disabilities that aren't that, where people can engage in some of these activities. So there are examples of collaborative planning and strategizing between disabled and able to change community, institutions, organizations to be more inclusive. Sorry, I want to finish reading that. It feels like more staff are necessary to meet people where they're at, and that feels like a barrier. Yeah. Yeah, and I actually think it's not a barrier. I think that what you're doing is really the first step of, and I think sometimes we let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So we think, well, if we can't make everything 1,000% accessible, then we can't do it at all, which isn't true. And so if we just start thinking of how can we be inclusive, how can we involve people, embrace people, make people feel welcome, that's really where it starts. And so it's finding the people with disabilities, and again, not everyone with a disability is going to know how to make things accessible to others, but there are resources out there. So I think it's having people who share your interests, be involved in whatever your organization is, and then connecting with the resources that are out there in terms of what are ways to do this. So we can move on to the next slide. So when we talk about disability, people say, well, what's disability culture, and how do you get competent at it? So we'll start with what's disability culture. So what is culture in general, right? It's a shared history, it's a shared experience, it's arts, it's food, it's celebrations. So, people with disabilities definitely share a history. And it's not a pretty, like a lot of groups, and not just in this country, but around the world, it's not necessarily a pretty history. But we share that history. We have a shared experience, again, that involves both, kind of discrimination and being kept out, but also a lot of, resilience and strength. We have a unique history. I mean, one of our shared experiences, particularly for kids with disabilities, it's very similar lived experience for most, not all, to interracial adoptees, because they're raised by people who aren't like them. And as wonderful as their parents are, this is not anything against parents, birth or adoptive parents, but when you're not sharing that's a very unique experience that people have. And that forms kind of some cultural stuff. We have a lot of disability arts. There's a place called the Access Gallery on Santa Fe that does a lot with disability arts, and it's everything from paintings to tactile art, which is really cool. And that isn't the only play. There's a theater troupe called Family that's all disabled actors and actresses that do shows. There's a dance troupe called Spoken Motion. So there's all kinds of disabled arts that are pure disabled arts. Celebrations, again, we don't have a ton. We celebrate the Americans with Disabilities Act in July 26th of every year. There's a International Disability Day that's in the fall. I think it's December 1st, and then there's some stuff that happens in October. But we have those kinds of celebrations, and people always say, well, so what is the food? Well, it's silly. And when I used to talk at schools, I'd bring food, because the food that you'll see at any disability gathering, it's all going to be the same type, and it's not going to be the healthiest thing on the planet, but it's stuff that doesn't fall apart easily, that's easy to eat with your hands, and that isn't usually is like not really liquidy, because a lot of us are really klutzy. So those kinds, so you know, you'll see it like at a disability protest, they'll always be like McDonald's hamburgers, because they're small, they're easy to grab. Not great for those of us that prefer not eating meat, but they're really simple. And so things that you can buy that are, again, already cut, often are things that are good for people with disabilities, because again, for people that have trouble with that kind of stuff. So I always say, you know, that's kind of our food. And it's, again, it's often not, you know, granola, but you'll see the same kind of thing at any disability gathering. So, so that's just kind of disability cultural. So now we're going to talk about ableism and how has ableism kind of shaped our experience. So we'll start with what ableism is. And it's, you know, there are all these academic things. I always say it's the wrong idea that disability is bad or abnormal. Disability is part of the human experience, but it's oppression or discrimination that's based on a characteristic. We all have experienced ableism, and we all have perpetrated it. It's similar to, you know, has commonalities with racism, sexism, homophobia, because it's both implicit and explicit. Even though I've been doing disability rights work for decades, I have ableist thoughts and feelings that I catch myself in, because I was raised in the same. Just like, you know, the deep ideas that we have on other characteristics like race, ethnicity, etc. Does anyone want to share some things that might be ableist? I mean, I can give, you know, an example, which is this was many years ago. I was applying for a job working with teenagers, and the person interviewing me, said, how would you be able to keep up with teenagers? And because I use a wheelchair, and it's like, well, I'm not going to chase them up trees, but that was like, you know, you're not physically working with teenagers is much more a connection thing than any kind of physical thing. I wasn't applying to be like a guide for a camping program or something. It was an indoor kind of program. So that's an example of when someone, you know, kind of makes an assumption that someone with a disability can or can't do something. Anyone want to raise other things that you think might be ableist, or something that you question?
Just like you mentioned, having separate classes for people with disabilities versus not, there's no reason why they can be integrated. Right.
And assuming that if someone learns differently, that everyone in a class has to learn the same way for it to be effective for everyone. And I think with schools, there's this fear that if you have kids that have a disability that might make them slower, that's somehow going to stunt the learning of the more advanced kids. And that the data actually shows that it does the opposite, that when you have people with different abilities learning together, and it actually enhances everyone. Any other thoughts or ideas?
I think it goes to the family as well as the individual. So like, assume somebody wrote helping someone without asking, but it's like just making all these kinds of assumptions about the rest of that person's family and how they function and what they can and can't do on the weekend or whatever it may be.
Yeah, so some friends of mine, their husband and wife, and he has a very significant disability. He he doesn't have any movement in his body and he uses a ventilator, and she has a psychiatric disability, and but she's physically not disabled, and people always say to her like, oh, you must be such a saint to take care of him, and she's always like, oh, you don't know the half of it. Because I mean, and again, they're great for each other, but like it's this whole attitude that like somehow it's a burden to live with someone with a disability. And she feels very lucky. He's a great father, a great grandpa at this point. Really understands her. They're a good couple, so they each put stuff. Always this assumption that she's somehow this like long suffering person because she's with him. And then people also assume that she doesn't have a disability of her own, which is not accurate.
And I can add to that. So in my family, my niece is very disabled. She's only 4 years old. And I've had people ask me after I describe the situation, they'll ask me, so are her parents really smart? And I'm like, what? Like they're assuming that maybe she has this disability because of genetic like weirdness in like her parents. And I'm like, that's such a strange question.
Wow.
But I've had that question a couple times, like what is the cognitive ability of their parents? And I say, yeah, one has a PhD and the other as a professional engineer. Get over it, move on.
Right. That's bizarre. So speaking of kids who are born with a disability, what do people generally say when they find out a kid is born with a disability? What are the thoughts or feelings that?
I think a lot of times people will like almost take pity on that child. They're like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like
Exactly.
It's like they think that their entire life is over before it even begins when they have a disability.
Right. Yeah, without even kind of knowing what it is, it's automatically seen as like a tragedy. And again, I'm not saying it's not hard for parents because they're expecting one thing and it's something different. But that also happens. I mean, like we've all heard the stories of someone who thinks they're pregnant with one and it ends up being twins because the second one was like hidden in the ultrasound. And no one in that case says, I'm so sorry. They're like, and that's also a huge change from what the person was planning. So, and then when someone becomes disabled, most people think like, oh, that's awful, right? Like if someone's in a skiing accident, and it might be awful at the time, I mean, if again, sometimes people, you don't know if they're going to live or not, but the fact that someone acquires a disability is seen generally by society as tragic, not as wow, that's going to be a hard change and you're going to need to adjust, but as tragic. And that again, the person certainly is going to feel that way for a while. But what's really helpful for people is to understand that, life doesn't come with guarantees and there are going to be changes, but you're still the person you were. And people can start a life. And people do that all the time for a lot of reasons. People get divorced. People might lose a job that was really tied up in their identity and have to kind of reinvent themselves. People go, I mean, we have a whole bunch of people in, Superior and Louisville who are having to start over their lives, because of the fire. And that's hard. I mean, that's really hard. But often when it's disability, people say, and I certainly had said this earlier in my life, oh, well, I'd rather be dead than have to go through that. You didn't hear anyone with the fire saying, I'd rather be dead than lose my house. I mean, I hope people didn't say that. But, but you could still say, wow, that's got to be really hard. And so it's just a very elevated response to a major life change. So if you can go to the next one. And so I talked about what disability culture was, and then I talked about ableism. So what does that have to do with disability cultural competency? So addressing ableism is really the road to disability cultural competency. And again, it's not something that you're going to, address in a 90-minute webinar. It's just like working on our racism, our classism, all of the other things that I think try and work on when we're trying to be decent humans. Is how do we integrate this into our filters and into our thinking on an ongoing basis? So I wanted to share a little bit about the evolution of our community. So again, we've only had civil rights since 1990, a little over 30 years. And this was a march that was in the 80s, I think, to support the ADA. One of the things that we when we were trying to get the civil right, get the ADA passed, we really thought, and again, we didn't have anything to base it on, but in those days we were saying, if we just have the ADA, then we will be totally just like everyone else. Like there won't be any need for disability rights. We will be just like everyone else. Well, of course that wasn't true. And in those days, we were very focused on being normal and appearing normal. And there was even a movement called normalization to try and make people with disabilities act like people without disabilities. And to basically erase anything that looked disabling, to the point of, people would sometimes have surgeries to make their bodies look straighter. Even though there wasn't really a medical benefit, that people looked like less spazzy, kind of. And unbeknownst to anyone, years later, those surgeries caused a lot of pain. But what was important at the time, and this started kind of after the polio epidemic, was people appearing normal. And so then in the 90s, so, we got the law passed in 1990. We started trying to implement the law. There was several years of ramping up. And then there was kind of a backlash against people with disabilities after people started to really try and enforce the law. And what's kind of evolved in the last 10, 15 years is really the idea of disability pride. And of people saying, you know what, we're not going to be just like everyone else. And that shouldn't be our goal. And we can be okay with who we are. And it's not a contradiction to both embrace disability culture and want to be integrated. Because for a long time, we couldn't quite figure out. So if we want to be with our, for example, a lot of kids with disabilities go to these camps in the summer. And for a lot of them, it's the only time when they're with other people like them, especially since schools have become integrated. And they love that. And so, but then people are like, well, that isn't integrated. We can't do that. And there's been almost this like super focus on everything has to be integrated. And I think we're getting to the point where we can say, no, you know what, we can enjoy time with our own community and our own people, and we can also be part of the world. And it's not an either or. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So people are different. So for example, in your work, the people that are outdoorsy people will want to do these kinds of things. People that aren't might not. But that shouldn't really be based on disability. Now, does that mean that everyone with a disability will be able to, climb on every rock that exists? No. There's some things that people might not be able to do. There's some things that a lot of sports people it needs to be done in an adapted way, like skiing is a great example. Colorado's like the capital of disabled skiing, but it's not like we get on two skis and stand up and go down the hill like a non-disabled person. We do it differently, and blind skiers too. And we have to have someone with us to kind of help us do that, because we wouldn't be able to like totally get up if we flop over. So we're kind of coming to that, just like say in the past 10, 15 years. And hopefully this next generation will come and realize who they are is great. And it's okay to say they're disabled and ask for accommodations. And they also shouldn't have lowered expectations because of it. That they should expect, and they should also expect to compete. and they should have disappointments and be able to learn from them just like everyone else. Because for so many years, people with disabilities were segregated, but were also way overprotected. So they weren't, I remember being at a meeting at a school for a kid with a disability, and I said, what does he need to graduate? Like, I was asking like how many credits were left. And someone said, oh, well, we just let, in special ed, we just let them choose that. I'm like, I'm talking about a 15-year-old boy. I mean, he's going to say he needs to play more video games if we let it, like, that's not appropriate. We don't let other teenagers choose what they want. You say this is what you have to do. And if someone needs support to do it, then provide the support, but don't let them out of it. So that's just been kind of our trajectory over from being total exclusion to kind of how we dealt with the backlash and kind of where we're coming out now. And we'll see. I'm excited about our next generation. So we can go to the next slide. And Karina, can you read this one?
Intersectionality. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Audrey Lorde.
Yes. I'd like to put this slide in. If there was more time, I'd have a number that follow. But if you look at any kind of outcome, if you layer disability on top of race, particularly, but also on top of gender, sexual orientation or sexual or gender expression, you'll see things. So for example, with employment, people with disabilities in general have really bad employment outcomes. Fewer than 30% of us have full-time, full-year jobs. If you then talk about Black men or Indigenous women, the numbers get even much scarier. So we think of disability rights and disability justice as an intersectional issue that can't and shouldn't be separated from the other forms of oppression and discrimination. That you've got to, this work all has to be done together and thought about together. And also that disability is not a white issue. Disability, if you look at percentages of who has disabilities and who doesn't, in Colorado, the rate is 10.2%, but if you look in the tribal communities, it's over 16%. And I think that's an undercount. So any kind of oppression, I think you have to put that intersectional lens on. If you could go to the next slide. So so we talked about the ADA and disability rights earlier, and what is accessibility? And accessibility, Microsoft actually has like some good definitions because they talk about making things so that everyone can use and enjoy them. So for example, if we look at, physical accessibility, I think we all know what a ramp is, what a curb cut is. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen it. I think it's a TED Talk or a YouTube called the curb cut effect, which shows that curb cut, like accessibility features help everyone. So people like, I like curb cuts because I use a wheelchair, but I know skateboarders like them too, and bicyclists and mothers with strollers. I can tell you for a fact that every single person in this country who travels likes the accessible stalls in the airports. So accessibility is something that shouldn't be seen as like just for some people. I know when I ride the bus, I appreciate that they have the automatic stop announcements. I can hear and I can see, but that way I can work or read or daydream. So I think accessibility is really what it takes for everyone. And I always want to kind of talk about digital accessibility. So on a website, and there's a lot more than I would have time to talk about, but if you go on a website, you want to make sure that someone who can't see or can't hear has the same experience that other people have. So can it be used by a screen reader? If there's a video with their captions, and no, the automatic YouTube captions don't count because they don't say what you say. They're funny, but they don't say what you say. And again, but it also means what we call the invisible ramp. So for example, if you're having a big conference for people who might be autistic, they might need, they don't need a ramp, or they probably don't need a ramp. What they might need is a room to go be quiet in for if it gets really loud or overwhelming. Some people might need a buddy to kind of guide them through a registration line if they're going to get overwhelmed. Some people might need a larger, large print. And again, in this day and age, we're not even printing out paper. It might just be, don't, make it a flattened PDF so no one can enlarge it themselves. Some people might need someone to help them understand something. Some people might need more rest breaks. Those are all things. And I think the more, and hopefully what this pandemic has taught us is that it pays to accommodate people. Up until 2 years ago, working at home was a huge fight for a lot of people who needed to do that for their disability. And all kinds of businesses said, oh, there's no way, it's impossible. You can never supervise people who work at home. They might do their laundry while they're having a meeting. Like, who cares? But everyone thought it was impossible. And then all of a sudden in March of 2020, we all figured it out overnight. And a lot of things that people didn't think we could figure out, we figured out. So when someone says, I need this, I think the automatic response, particularly if you're running something like, I've put on conferences, and the last thing I want to hear when I'm totally stressed out with 800 details, and it's always at the last minute, is someone saying, I don't even care what it is. I don't want to hear it. But I think when we can take a breath and realize someone might say, I need something, and you might not be able to deliver it, but instead of saying, no, we can't do that, engage in a conversation, because you might not be able to do that, whatever that is, but you might be able to do something. And often it's just that conversation but the bigger thing is putting out that you're open to it. So one thing, and we can go to the last slide, to talk about kind of what legal compliance versus a welcoming culture. And the ADA says what you have to do. But there are things you can do to indicate that you welcome people. So one is to put on any kind of flyer for an event. If you need a disability accommodation, here's a phone number or an email. Just put out that you're open to it. And it's okay to say, ahead of time, please. When you're putting out a job announcement, to say we encourage, and hopefully it won't just be disability, but we encourage diverse applicants, of all, people from all racial groups, disability groups, everything, because you get a better workforce when it's a more diverse workforce, just because people think differently based on their life experiences. Make sure your job description doesn't have inappropriate qualifications. Like, one of the things that I see all the time is they say you need a driver's license when what you really need is to be able to get around. Now, if you're driving for your job, like if you're applying to be a bus driver or a driver, or something where you actually are physically have to drive, of course you need a driver's license. But if what you need is to be able to get to different offices or even get around the state, you don't need to drive to do that. A lot of times it says you have to be able to lift 50 pounds, or you have to be able to sit for 4 hours. Well, again, they have those desks that move. I know people who can't sit for more than an hour, but they can certainly do a desk job if they have an adapted desk. So a lot of times we think people have to do something, and they really don't. There are really ways around it. So look at what's really essential. But it's mostly like sending the message for people with disabilities that because of the history, often if we aren't told that we're welcome, we kind of assume that we're not. So that's why I say, like, a welcoming culture goes beyond legal compliance. Legal compliance means you have someone looking over your website, you make sure that programs are accessible, you make sure that when you're hiring, you're not discriminating. There's checklist things. Welcoming culture is when you're putting it out that you welcome people, but, and again, as coworkers, as employees, as volunteers, as guests at these really cool places that you all work out. That's more of a welcoming culture. And I wanted to leave some time just for questions or comments. Any questions or comments, anything I didn't address? No? Well, I want to thank you. Well, okay, what has been the hardest thing to get the non-disabled community to understand? Wow. I think probably like long-term, the biggest thing is that disability is a social justice and civil rights issue. It's not a problem to be solved. But the other thing that people have a really hard time with is people whose disabilities are not static. So, like I know people that they use a wheelchair sometimes and they walk sometimes, or people with certain kinds of like with cognitive or psychiatric issues where like sometimes they can handle a lot and sometimes they can't. And I think it's really hard for people to deal with that inconsistency and to say, but I saw you do that. What do you mean you can't do this today? Or why do you need this accommodation? You know, why do you need to, because I saw you do this. So I think those are the two things that come to mind.
Would it be better to ask someone with a disability what they need or let them come to you asking for what they need?
I kind of a combination. So I'd say let them come to you, but put out there that you're willing to hear from them. So now if someone is obviously struggling, you know, you can say like, can I help, or do you need something? You know, like if but normally, you know, and again, I think where people are in different places in their process. So, you know, often when you're newly disabled, I know I was like this when I was first a wheelchair user. It's like, no one's going to open a door for me. Now I'm like, oh, thank you. I'd love to not have to fight with the door. And that maybe that's age, maybe that's time, whatever. So people are just in different phases. Sometimes people don't know what they need, but to just say, if there's something you need, you also don't even have to make that about disability. So like, I'm just looking at Garrett where it says Bluff Lake Nature Center, and I don't know what that is, but if you're taking in tours and you can say, if there's something we can do for any of you to make this easier, it doesn't have to always even be about disability. That opens it up for people with disabilities. You know, for someone to say, you know, I can't hear you. Can I stand at the front because I can't hear you when you're giving this tour, whatever.
Julie, can you say some respond to like this big idea I've been thinking about is like there's so many different like neuro abilities and they're becoming more, it's becoming more and more acceptable to even address or notice or talk about or even bring it up. And as educators, it's like really kind of, it's super challenging to consider how am I have no skills in dealing with different neuro abilities. How, if I want to be that welcoming presence and say, we want everyone to feel welcome and we want to help you and we're going to do the best we can. And then you know, it's like, yes, and I don't have any idea how to do that. Like, I'm thinking like people on the autism spectrums of, or whatever, all the different, there's so many varieties of what people are living with.
Yeah, and that's, you don't have to know. I mean, I think you can say, you know, tell me what you need and I'll try and accommodate it. So like, you don't have to know, you don't have to be an expert on everyone's life. Because you can take two people with autism and they might have totally different needs. So one thing people with disabilities need to learn is to like be able to say, here's what I need. And kind of, and to some extent, here's how I accommodate myself. So, you know, I know a lot of people with the autism, like their parents like give them headphones because you can't make things quiet. Like you can't, for example, go on a plane and assume it's going to be quiet at the airport. So your job is more to be open to hearing, not to know everything ahead of time, because there's no way any of us can do that.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, there are some good websites. Thank you, Karina. So thank you all. Thanks for thanks for the work you do. Thanks for participating. And I want to find a way to get to Netherlands and see bears. I didn't know that was there, and I love bears. So, so anyway, have a great rest of your day, and hopefully you're all having indoor days today too.
Thank you so much, Julie, for
Thanks.
the amazing presentation. It was so amazing.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. You guys all have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care.